Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guests for the next 4 episodes will be Nduka and Peter Midgley. Nduka is Associate Professor and Graduate Program Coordinator at the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario. He's also an author and co-editor of 8 books on creative writing and academic research. But we'll be talking with him about his latest collection of poetry, his third, called DisPlace, which was published in October 2021 by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Peter Midgley is an independent scholar, writer, and editor who worked with Nduka on DisPlace. This 4-part series is brought to you in part by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Nduka's poetry deals with the politics of language, ideas of place, the diaspora, and the colonization of knowledge. His poetry is conversational, spiritual, and performative. If you closely consider the title, DisPlace, you'll notice the pidgin pronunciation of this place, but also displace and the simultaneous feelings of belonging and attachment, where you are now and where you once were. It's a direct reference to Nduka's Nigerian background and points to a characteristic of his poetry that is, as Nduka calls it, beyond world literature. In this first episode, we'll talk about how the collection came together, how Peter came to become its editor, and oral poetry and poetry as performance. All right, Nduka and Peter, welcome to the program. So you both were familiar with each other before you worked on DisPlace, right? Can you each talk about your recent backgrounds, how you initially crossed paths, and then how you came together for this project? Nduka, why don't we start with you?
Oh, thanks for that question. I moved from Nigeria in 2006 to Alberta, Edmonton precisely, to University of Alberta for my PhD.
Mm-hmm.
And while in Edmonton, Peter turned out to be one of those people that I met within the cluster of writers. At that time, there was this kind of effervescence of new writers, immigrant writers. So at that point, there were groups that were organizing poetry within the city itself and also the campus. And
Mm-hmm.
so, given our interest, it looked inevitable that I would meet Peter, and it became even more interesting when I finally got together with him. To see that we share similar interests. He has a very strong passion for oral poetry and
Mm-hmm.
oral literature, and I have that passion too. And as a matter of fact, my research was in oral literature. So within these 2 strands of University of Alberta community and the literary community, Peter and I had more interactions. And then, much later, it also turns out that he is such a very fine editor. And I remember my first performance together with Peter. I'm not sure he's going to remember now. It was at the CAST conference, and I had performed my poetry, and Peter finally performed. And it was my very first time of seeing him. He is such a spectacular performer. In fact, he's one of those poets that make you realize how cool the printed page is, and especially with regard to oral poetry in Africa, how dull the lines would appear without a voice. And that even warmed me up more, to relating to him. And we became friends. But it was not until much later when, began to see various interests, scholarly and creative, that our interactions actually increased. And Peter was almost, the publisher of oral literature book, which I pitched with University of Alberta Press.
Mm-hmm.
Things happened, and then he moved on. So when the opportunity came for this collection, and this was completely out of my control. I didn't realize that destiny and the African gods, had a plan, for Peter and I to ultimately work together. And so when I pitched this book with Laurier University Press, which I had admired, and which was one of the first poetry publishers that I got in touch with, or rather that I got to know about at the University of Alberta, where I was formally introduced to Canadian poetry by Professor Bert Almond, who himself is a poet. I was really looking forward to their being interested, and Peter encouraged me to submit to that press. at that point that he encouraged me, that was where the business ended. I was pleasantly surprised when Wilfrid Laurier University Press chose Peter as the editor for this collection. And I was like, wow. And I said, Peter, finally, the gods have brought us together.
Right.
That's excellent.
Yeah, and I'm a writer and editor with a long-standing interest in African literatures, the history of African literature, as well as in orators and oral literatures. I find these terms problematic, and we'll get to talk about that a bit later on. But it was inevitable that Nduka and I would meet up at the University of Alberta. I have made a conscious effort to stay in touch with the African diasporic community after my own arrival here. I have tried always to create an awareness of the writing and the diversity of the voices that come from that community. And so it's inevitable for me to be involved, to be interested in these kinds of projects. So really supportive of the Karina Vernon's project.
Yep.
Prairie Archive.
Prairie Archive, that's it. So incredibly supportive of these kinds of projects, and it's just a thrill to be invited to become part of that larger discussion from where I'm standing as a person. So I'm not a stranger to Nduka's work. As you know, we've known each other for a while. We were both PhD students at the university and shared common interests. So, yeah.
Excellent. And Nduka, you're currently teaching, and where is that, and what are you teaching?
I'm teaching at Carleton University, Ottawa.
Okay.
And I teach courses primarily affiliated to the Institute of African Studies, but I also cross-appointed to the Departments of English and the School of Journalism and Communication. This term, I am teaching an English course, which is English 2926A, African Literatures 1. And next time, I'm teaching Spoken Word, which is a new course
nice.
that we are designed and we're very excited about. So that's what I'm doing at the University of at Carleton University.
Yeah, you mentioned Karina Vernon's collection. That we interviewed her on this podcast a while back too, so that was excellent to get to talk to her. So initially, Nduka, you worked with Chris Dunton, who is also a specialist in Nigerian literature on this collection. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how far that collaboration took you on this project, and you know, at the point where you kind of hooked up with Wilfrid Laurier, what was still left for you and Peter to work on?
That's a very interesting question. Yes, Chris Dunton I had known by reputation, and I had also met him briefly in Nigeria back in the days. He used to visit frequently. He was one of these early critics of African literature and one of the more prominent critics of African literature. But he is also a writer, having published a fictional work. And the more fascinating thing about Chris Dunton is that he also was engaged in oral literature studies and had done extensive work on the Hausa language literature and also more in Pidgin, and had actually published a book on Pidgin literature. And so I was very fascinated by the prospect of working with him during the COVID. COVID had just started. And then I was on sabbatical, and I was thinking through some projects that I had been looking forward to, opportunity to actually, number one, complete things that I have been brooding and actually conceptualizing in my mind. And it was Chris's idea. So, Nduka, what's been happening to your work? What are you working on? And I said, I've been thinking about this poetry book. I have some new poems, and that I'm also writing the poems, being at home, spending time at the backyard, and, getting back into my bird watching hobby. And then I got some of those poems, and I'll be contemplating a lot about a new collection. I said, very well. So why don't you go ahead and do it, and let's see. I said, I don't think I have the appetite at this time to begin to select this poem, the points that I wanted, but I was happy to do it. So he said, send them to me. And he did the preliminary selections and said, what do you think about that? And at that point, I became even more driven, to get this come together. So I had these new poems and I included the new poems. And so that concept ended at that point in time. And so we had something of a manuscript. And he had done some of the preliminary edits. But I thought that, I also discussed this with Peter. I said, Peter, what do you think? At that time, I wasn't thinking of Peter as an editor, but Peter had been an unofficial editor to me. I don't think there is any book that I've done that he didn't know about. As a matter of fact, our book on oral literature, he unofficially edited some of the chapters, the introduction. But somebody I respect very highly, and his efficiency as an editor always amazed me, in addition to his own creative work. So we started on this unofficial basis that I had mentioned earlier. And when I sent this manuscript to Wilfred Laurier University Press, I was excited when it was adopted. It was Peter that had early on introduced me to Siobhan. I hope I'm calling the name right now. And so when it was accepted and Peter was assigned or graciously agreed to edit it, he reinvented the collection in a sense. I'm sure his modesty.
I don't know if there was any grace involved. I leapt.
His modesty, your modesty wouldn't let you accept that. So he looked at it. You don't always find writers who are good editors. I'm not so sure I am, despite the fact that I've been an editor as a journalist. Peter has a very fine eye for those details. So having a poet edit a work is both problematic and useful. Problematic in the sense that the poet reads some of the poems from his own style and perspective, and good in the sense that the poet can also relate to the cadences and to the nuances that you're dealing with, and would also have the universe, especially for the kind of poet that I am, one who engages in a lot of conversations with other poets and life and all of that going on at the same time. I thought that it was quite the most appropriate choice. And I did communicate this to the Wilfred Laurier University Press folks to say, I am very, very excited. So at this point that he took it on, there were certain lines whose inflections Peter thought, they didn't quite capture or were actually looking to. So he applied a different kind of editing. I had to put it out there because I know that his modesty is going to continue to make him to resist it.
No,
but it worked for the better for Peter. What do you think?
Editing poetry is such a fascinating thing, because you say working as an editor who is also a poet is problematic. I don't think so. I think it gives you insight. One of the things about editing is that you actually have to get into the voice of whoever whose work you are working with. You have to break it down to understand the structures, the rhythms of the language. So your own poetry grows out of that, obviously, because you're working at this microscopic level. And so being a poet and understanding those rhythms, and especially somebody who works with oral forms of poetry as well. And again, I have a problem with defining oral poetry and poetry. All poetry is meant to be performed, other than strictly page poetry. It's such an artificial distinction. It's about performance. It's about music and musicality. So you can bring all of that without necessarily bringing the influence of saying I am a poet and bringing particular poetic sensibilities. It's about the music of the language and hearing it.
Yeah, Pierre, I agree that it's a musicality, but I also agree there is a certain distinction between the one that is written specifically for performance and one that is, meant to be enjoyed, just reading it. For example, if you read some of the poems of, say, Edward Brathwaite, the Barbadian poet whose work I enjoy a lot, the lines that are repeated, in fact, we can use the province now, or the genre, spoken word poetry. When it is, even if some people might hesitate about qualifying it as spoken, there's a sense in which that definition helps the writer, even in the construction of the work. So I recognize that, yes, a lot of these poems are meant to be performed, but there are even more poems that are meant to be performed. in terms of the line arrangement, in terms of the repetition. In fact, in some cases, you see the repetition as this is very bad poetry. This is no poetry, but it's written a song. And you see that a lot of poets, or some poets, especially from the African tradition, call their collection songs, songs of the marketplace, like Shundari would say, because they are conceived in the traditional African sense of song, of poetry as song, poetry as performance, as describable.
Yeah, you find this with Imbongi and the praise poets that Izibongo that they sing, which are impromptu praise poems. And again, praise poems is an imperfect translation here, but what we call praise poems are impromptu creations. There are no line breaks. They are spoken. They move along. Any line breaks that happen in the presentation of it in a written form is that an editor applies after the fact. So whereas in English, you have very specific stanza formats and lines. These are artificial additions in African writing. So you could easily render a lot of this as a prose poem without any line breaks. So it's there it becomes fascinating. Where do you make these breaks, and where do you not? Where do you preserve the flow of language, and where do you try and create a westernized poetic structure out of it? So what was left for us to do is one of the questions you ask at some point is, right. It's that kind of stuff is assessing where do we make these breaks? Where do we, what works and what doesn't work?
Right. So Peter, in order to do that, did you feel like you needed to be especially familiar with Nduka's previous work? I mean, I suppose you would have to be.
I always, whenever I edit any kind of poetry, I try and read as much as I can of that poet's work, because I have to understand your language. I have to go and do my research into cultural aspects. What is informing your literature? Our literature is not divorced from the societies we live in. I do not believe that. Fundamentally, I don't. So I have to understand that before I can actually edit your work. I have to begin to understand something about the language that informs the writing, especially with African languages, where we have 3,000 plus languages spread throughout Africa, and that informs the literatures that get produced.
Right.
You have to understand something of the history of that language, of the history of colonization, to understand the literature that is being written at that particular point. So yes, coming to Nduka, I have to do that research first.
Excellent.
And I would like to chime in there to say that when Peter got this brief, he took a while, because I consider that a fermentation process, during which he, I believe, was mulling through this collection and the selection. And what he did, because he was familiar with the work, was also to go back to the original collections, when the need arose. And he was able to compare what he had and the versions in which cases that had occurred, to make to advise on what he thought would be the ideal way to go. Nowhere even more evident than the introduction, which by the time you read it, you could see that this is introduction by somebody who had lived through, inhaled and exhaled, these lines, and have come up with his interpretation of it.
You see, there were also, in terms of what is left to do after Chris's fabulous work, is the collection was longer then than what the requirements for this particular introductory series needs. We had to cut that selection further, but we also took the opportunity to revisit the originals, simply because of typesetting, the availability of book design and typesetting at the original. There were run over lines. So a 3-line stanza is suddenly presented as a 4 or 5-line stanza. But with modern technology, we were able to revert to the author's original intent of a 3-line stanza, for instance. So we were able to curate that. We were also working often within a paucity of archival resources within African countries and Nigeria in particular, there were often the occasional misquotes of particular materials. We were able to correct that, such little infelicities that had crept through where memory and has failed the author. We could go back and correct that. So we've managed to do that. Also, in the process of seeking out permissions for some of this poetry, we weren't able to acquire permissions for some pieces, so we had to excise those, which meant going back and modifying the correction. So although these are selected, many of these poems have been revised and are fresh for this collection. So a lot of that work needed to be done. And then also trying to make decisions about how much annotation to do, what orthographic conventions to use within the text. These are incredibly political decisions within this context of African literature, and African diasporic literature.
Mm-hmm.
How much prevalence do we give to English, and how much do we normalize Igbo in this context as part of an English, not as Igbo, but as part of a Nigerian English and a diasporic English.
Right. And Peter, we should mention that Igbo is Nduka's Nigerian language, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
The advantage of improved electronic and digital archives has served us a lot, as I was saying, because by the time the original compositions were made, certain words were not in general use. But we found out working with the series editor, Tanis, that some of these words were already available in some kind of urban dictionary of Nigerian words. And so we didn't think also that it was necessary to start explicating or qualifying or putting glossaries to those ones, in addition to the ideological position that we had adopted. And it was just a question of being fortunate to find a text and a work that had an editor that could also think through and share the kind of experiences and cultural politics that the poet was into.
Yeah. And in the introduction, I also just want to touch on this briefly here, is that when we say these are Igbo words, we have to understand that Igbo itself is as a language, is really a blanket reference to many related languages that make up this language, and that the written form tends to specific forms of that and particular languages within that cluster of languages. So to say Igbo is also not entirely correct. And I go into this in the introduction. The matter of language is complex and fascinating.
You just heard from Nduka Otiono, an associate professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario, and author of the recent collection of poetry called DisPlace, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Also joining us was Peter Midgley, the collection's editor and an independent scholar. This episode is brought to you in part by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week for a conversation about the characteristics of Nduka's poetry and how it attempts the decolonization of knowledge.
And so within this context also is how, some of us intentionally or sometimes unintentionally struggle with the necessity of decolonizing language, of decolonizing knowledge, because our training is immersed in Western tradition. You think in terms of sonnets, probably, in a more organized form with a degree in English up to a PhD. And then you come and you start hearing terms like post-colonial literature. These are terms that are not African in its sense, but they are also loaded politically, as ways of subjugating different cultures to some imperial and central culture.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media assistant Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.